Back to Sledgehammer Horror, guys. I am Ken Sledge, and let's talk horror. Today, I am joined by the amazing Sam. She needs a priest. How you doing today?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so honored to do this. Our buddy Justin hooked us up with each other, and I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen. So I want to talk a little bit about you before we talk about the reason why you're here. She's been writing and blogging for the better part of her whole life.
Mm,
Started writing a horror anthology. Her short story, The Buck, was also recently published with horroraddicts.net.
mm.
And you also write movie reviews for your blog, as well as
That's right.
wickedcatclothing.com.
Yeah.
And you can get a 30% discount if you use the code priest30 at checkout. And the thing is, you guys don't have to remember any of this because the links for all this is down here in the description. So make sure you're checking out Wicked Cat Clothing, because not only is it some dope ass clothing, but you can get 30% off if you use the code priest30 right now, as well as Instagram. TikTok is also, you do horror related content there. And as
Mhm.
I've said before, those links are down here in the description, guys. So you don't got to go searching for it. I promise She Needs a Priest is right down here in the description. So obviously, you're big in the horror world and the horror genre. What made you decide to actually start blogging and writing about the horror genre?
It's funny you should ask that. It was probably COVID. It was only about a little over a year ago. I decided my job was super stressful. I couldn't go anywhere. So I decided I really like horror movies. So maybe I'll start a new blog because I have been blogging off and on for a decade. I started my first blog back in 2011, and it's been like different topics over the years. So I thought I'd do a dedicated horror blog. So then I started posting to Instagram, and TikTok came a little bit later, but it was mostly my blog and Instagram initially. And I started getting on Twitter, and I started meeting a lot of other people in the horror community through Twitter. And then from there, I started watching TikTok videos. And then eventually I was like, I'm going to start making my own. So
Yeah.
yeah. And then, yeah. And the decision to write was right after I lost my job. Um, I have a couple physical disabilities. It's like invisible illness. So it's like autoimmune disease. And trying to work part-time, full-time is very difficult to manage. So I lost my job after COVID, and after the horrendous history of employment I've had, I decided I'm going to try to like do something for myself. So I decided to just put my nose to it and start writing.
That's really awesome. And I'm sorry, because I know, especially with an autoimmune disease, I know that COVID can be very, very scary for someone in your position. So I'm so grateful that you're healthy. I mean, not
Mhm.
healthy, but I'm grateful that you haven't had any bouts with COVID that were that dangerous yet. So uh,
I don't leave my house, so
good on you. Like, that's all. My wife's a respiratory therapist, so COVID is something in this house we take very, very seriously as well. So I'm very happy that you've been able to stay healthy this whole time. That's really, really awesome.
mhm. Thank
Um,
you.
and another bonus to people following you on Instagram and TikTok is they will be the first ones to know when your new podcast and YouTube channel start, which will be here very shortly.
That's
Obviously,
right.
I know we don't want to spoil too much because it's all still like in the pipeline, but what can
Yeah.
you tell us about the podcast and YouTube channel that'll be happening?
Well, for the last year, I followed a lot of other TikTokers that do horror content. And these three girls particularly stood out to me. So I've been following them, and I was like, wouldn't it be great if we could all get together and do something together? And so I messaged them, and they were all in. So we had our first meeting. We've discussed what we're going to do for our first 4 episodes. Um, we've got a Discord server set up. So the link for that, I'm going to add it to my link tree actually. But basically, we've decided it's going to be called the Let Us In podcast. So we're going to have a shorter, cleaned up version for YouTube and a more unedited version for a podcast to listen to. And the great thing about all 4 of us is that we're all very unique in our tastes, our appearances, the things that we like, the things that we don't like. So I think there's going to be some good banter, some good debate. We all have a great sense of humor as well. So I think it's going to be really fun, and I think it'll be really entertaining.
Oh, me too. And that's the best thing about the horror community. We could have such different opinions on everything and still be so civil and kind with each other about our
Yeah.
differences. So I'm
Yeah.
very, very excited to check that out. And as I said before, the link tree is already down here in the description. So
Yeah.
make sure you're checking back. Make sure you're following the Instagram and the TikTok. So you'll be able to get first access to the podcast and the YouTube channel when it does go live. So,
Oh yeah,
Sam,
we'll be promoting it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
please. And maybe by the time the episode airs, this might be get live. So click this link tree down here. Now, in order for you to become such an influence in the horror community, you had to watch a first horror movie at some point. So, Sam, I want to go back to the past and talk about what got you started in the horror genre, your first horror movie. And Sam, your first horror movie was?
Poltergeist. 1982's Poltergeist.
What an amazing start to the horror world. And I just said this recently on an episode. Poltergeist is very special to me because my kid sister looks just like Carol Ann. And when we were kids, like she would fuck with me all the time, touching the TV and stuff. So Poltergeist is very, very close to my heart. Do you remember about how old you were the first time you had seen it?
See, it came out in 82, so I would have been 8. And it back then it took a year for it to come out. So I think I was just before I turned 9. So there was like a period of about 3 or 4 months where I just watched a bunch of horror movies because my aunt next door got a VCR. So we were always going over there to rent movies. So Poltergeist was the first big horror movie experience. I'd seen little bits and pieces of things when I was young growing up, but this was the first one that I actually sat down to watch too. And my parents, I remember them having a big discussion whether or not I could handle it and whether or not I'd be okay afterwards. And my mom was like, oh, she can handle it. Like I like to read and I was into like creepy things already. And so they decided to let me watch. I mean, sure, I slept for the next 3 months on their bedroom floor every night, but I mean, you know, I got over it and I wanted more and more of that adrenaline. I loved it.
Right. And I often compare, and obviously, guys, I never ever would condone drug use, but I do compare your first horror movie to doing drugs for the first time.
Yes.
Like you get that high, and then you're
Yes.
constantly chasing that dragon again, trying to get that feeling again.
Yeah.
And with you being a young lady, I'm sure that Poltergeist affected you a little bit differently than it would have affected a young man like me, because your central character is a young female lead. And obviously, you got the brother and you got the dad, but really the focus is on the females of the story. They really are the main aspect of the story, is the females of the film. So, do you remember which scene it was that affected you the most?
It's hard to pick just one scene, but initially the scene where the TV, see, I come from a time where I remember static on the TV at the end of the CBC broadcasting day. So, pardon me, when I saw that part, because I was very close in age to Carol Ann, and not only that, I was a really sensitive kid. And by sensitive, it's something I still carry to this day. Like I've seen some weird things. But as a sensitive kid, close to that age, and the static and that hand coming out, I remember jumping because I was sitting on the floor in front of the TV. I jumped and I looked back at my mom. And she's like, it's just a movie. It's just a movie. And my dad was like, see, I told you she couldn't handle it. And I'm like, no, I want to keep watching. I want to keep watching it. But yeah, that was the first big scene. And then after that, it was probably the tree scene with Robbie, where the tree is outside. I lived in a very rural area. Nova Scotia is where I'm from. So it's mostly forest and woods here. Our backyard was woods, lots of trees. So seeing that great big tree, like I would see that outside of my window and I'd get creeped out. But seeing that in the movie and having it break through the window and then grab Robbie and pull him out and then start to eat him, I was like, can we just, that tree that's outside, can we just get rid of it?
Right. I have a very, very big disliking for any tree at this point. So I think those chainsaws know what they're doing. They have the right idea.
And then the third big thing was the clown scene. I had a ton of stuffed animals. I was an only child, so everybody gave me dolls and stuffed animals as a kid. I had tons. And I initially wanted one of those giant Smurfs back in the day. And seeing that clown scene when the clown's arms wrap around Robbie and pull him under the bed, not only did I never want a stuffed animal that was larger than me ever again, B, I now have a lifelong clown phobia. I still won't watch Terrifier. I won't watch Terrifier just because of it.
And that's a bummer because David kills it in that movie. It's such a great movie. Very scary, but I understand completely. Now, this movie is, I would go on to say, actually, this has become a very iconic film throughout the horror genre. There are so many tropes that have been ripped off directly from this film. And even though this film itself, ripped off the Indian burial ground stuff from films before, I think this is really the master of that. So when you look at movies today, do you think that Poltergeist, not only just for the horror genre, but this type of horror movie, this subgenre of possession, haunting type thing, do you think that you gravitate more towards that because of Poltergeist, or do you think that this was just the first horror movie and you branched out from there?
No, I think I gravitate towards it more because of Poltergeist and because I'm a sensitive person anyway. So I tend to gravitate towards like paranormal hauntings, creepy stuff like that. Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And what a way, I mean, like I said, with you being sensitive, to start with a movie like this with a character that of Carol Ann, that's almost a mirror image for you at that age to see this. So you couldn't write it any better than that. You know what I mean? Like, that's brilliant. So we talked about which scene affected you the most, but what would you say your favorite scene from Poltergeist would be?
I think my favorite scene is probably the scene where Diane falls into the swimming pool, and then all those coffins and the corpses start popping up around her, and everything's going crazy. The house is flashing. Steve's in there arguing with Mr. Teague, who is in Return of the Living Dead, by the way, that actor, arguing with him like, you moved the headstones, but you just left the bodies. Like, it was just such a big moment. And also the humor, like there's a lot of really good humor, which helped balance it out, which was great for a kid. Because you had, I found that Steve's character he had a lot of good, funny moments in the movie. But that scene with Jo Beth Williams in the pool, and then when you later on found out that a lot of those skeletons were possibly real, the nightmare fuel.
I agree. And one thing that you brought up is the comedic aspects of Poltergeist. Like, I love the scene where they're talking, when they first bring the mediums in and they're talking to them. They're like, we put this car down, and over the course of 12 hours, it moved about 3 inches. You'd never be able to know. They're like, oh, well, you're going to notice this. And then they open the door, like the record's spinning, the light is spinning around the room. And then it shows her just like drinking that tea. Like, she's just so wigged out. I love that scene, and the balance of comedy and horror in this movie is great, and that's what actually gives this movie a PG rating. Like, we have to forget, Poltergeist is PG. Like, what? Are you? I mean, the PG-13 rating wasn't around then, but still, I watched this for the first time on Fox 36 Toledo at like 2 p.m.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was like my first introduction to a gory scene was in that movie as well. One of the paranormal investigators goes to the fridge to get a pork chop, and then the pork chop, because he sees it's covered in maggots, and he goes in the bathroom and he rinses his face off to just try to collect himself, and his face starts peeling off and he starts ripping it off. I was so disturbed, but I was like, I love this.
Yeah. And that scene, it's done practically, and so I love that scene even to this day. Like, the practical effects of that scene, it doesn't look the greatest.
Big fan of practical effects. Love it.
Me too. And I'd rather have a practical effect that doesn't necessarily age well than a CGI effect that doesn't age well. Like, the differences in a CGI that doesn't age well and a practical that doesn't age well, to me, is totally monumental. Different.
Like, Fulci's probably one of my favorites when it comes to horror, and his practical, almost all of his effects were practical, and you can watch those movies from 1980 and 81 and they're still really good. Yeah,
because a great practical effect never goes out of style, and it never looks bad. So one question I usually ask, and it's gonna be kind of tricky here, would you like to see Poltergeist remade today? Now, obviously, that's already happened. We've already had the Poltergeist remake. So, did you watch the Poltergeist remake? And if so, what were your opinions on that film?
I watched it a long time ago and it couldn't have been that memorable because I really don't even remember much about it. But that the remakes of like 10, 15 years ago aren't quite the same as the remakes that are coming out today. Because today we have people our age that grew up watching those movies that really want to honor them. And I find like It is a really good example for that. The original was made for TV. There was only so much you could do. But when the new films came out, those were clearly fans of the It book and movie. And that's what I find with a lot of the remakes now. Like they're done by fans and they're typically done fairly well.
Right. And see, I'm with you. Like, I don't think remakes are inherently bad.
No.
I think there are bad remakes out there.
Yes.
But and we just recently did a top 10 least favorite horror movie remakes, and Poltergeist was my number one. And it's not because it's a bad film. The exact reason you just said, there was nothing memorable about the Poltergeist remake, especially in comparison to the
I
original
can't
film.
remember who was in it.
Yeah. So it's one of those movies where it wasn't bad, but if you're going to remake Poltergeist and I don't remember a damn thing about it, something's not right here.
Yeah,
So because
that's
the
how I
original
judge
was
horror
that
movies.
good.
Like if things like haunt you forever, that's a good movie. You know what I mean?
For sure.
Mhm.
So we talk about Poltergeist, and I asked you about the remake. Now, Poltergeist is I don't count the remake in this, but it is a trilogy. The original three, Poltergeist 1, 2, and 3. Have you seen the whole trilogy? And which one is your favorite of the trilogy?
The first one, followed by the second one. The Reverend, oh, what a creepy character. The scene in the second one where Steve swallows the tequila with the worm in it, and then he starts turning into this creature thing was some of the scariest. I was just like, I was still an early like preteen, I think, when that came out. So yeah, that preacher, iconic.
Reverend Kane.
Reverend Kane, right? I couldn't remember his name, but yes, he was an iconic figure, and man, he nailed that. That was. But the third one, I wasn't a fan of simply because I missed the rest of the cast. Like Jo Beth Williams and Craig T. Nelson weren't part of it. So
here's where I get scoffed at a lot. 3 is my favorite in the franchise.
Is it?
And I think it's because growing up, that's the one I watched the most. And actually, for me, it goes in reverse: 3, 2, then 1. But I still like 1 more than 80% of any other horror movie. That's not a knock at 1. But 3, I think, just scared me the most as a kid. Like the part when, obviously, anybody out there that has Shudder, if you haven't yet, they have a mini series on there, which they're going to be doing a season 2 of, called Cursed Films. And with that, they have an episode dedicated to Poltergeist. And in that, they talk about how they wish they would have done more to honor Heather O'Rourke in Poltergeist 3. She obviously passed away during filming due to a misdiagnosed stomach problem. And they didn't want to finish the film. And they called the studio and they were like, we can't do this. We can't finish it. And the studio was like, we don't give a fuck what you think. Finish the film. We've already dumped this much money into it. So they just threw an ending on the film. And that's why a lot of people don't like this film. And
yeah, I think that's what it was for me too.
Yeah,
I think
feel
it
the
left a
regret
bad
they
taste
had.
in my mouth, the fact that they released it after this little girl passed away. And I mean, she was like the center of these films, and to just disregard her like that, I think, it wasn't a good move, I don't think, by the production company, and I think the film really suffered for it.
Oh yeah, it's got the worst ending of the franchise for sure. And I think I agree with, because I watched that interview with the director, like he breaks down and he's like, we should have done, since the studio was making us finish this film, we should have done more to honor Heather. Like that's what we should have done. We should have done it in her memory rather than just being like, fuck it, put an ending on it and put it out then. But obviously at this point, you just lost someone at 12 years old that's so close to you. You're not going to be thinking about a movie at this point. If you're any type of real human being, I just lost a friend, a child, and I don't give a shit about this movie right now. So But we talked
That was
about
pretty much how
Poltergeist.
I felt. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about Poltergeist and what that means to you. But my little buddy Ghostface here has a question for you. What's
Okay.
your favorite scary movie, Sam? What is
Oh
your
gosh.
favorite horror movie of all time?
Oh, it's such a tough question to answer. Um, I usually gravitate towards The Thing.
Uh, the John Carpenter one,
John Carpenter
or
original with Kurt
okay,
Russell, yes.
okay,
Simply because that was my first introduction to cosmic horror and Lovecraftian horror, as well as a lot of body horror. Like
yeah.
that spider head scene. Yeah, my parents eventually had to buy a fold-out chair to put in the bedroom because of The Thing.
Oh, that's
And I
great.
own it. It's right there.
And we were just talking about practical effects. My top three practical effect movies, in no order at all, are the original Nightmare on Elm Street,
Hmm.
and American Werewolf in London, and
Yes.
The Thing. To me,
Yeah.
I don't think when you're looking for practical effects, you cannot get better than those three films. To me, if you ever want to learn about the best way to do practical effects and do them right, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Thing, American Werewolf in London. Those three movies will educate you on the best ways to use practical effects.
Yeah. Well, I
And
mean,
The Thing is
Baker
just one of those
won.
movies that, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say Rick Baker won the Oscar, I think, for American Werewolf for his werewolf transition. And the thing about those movies too is that they've aged so well because of those effects.
Yeah. And
Like they're
that's
so
honestly what
scary.
bothered me about the remake slash prequel slash sequel to each of those films. Like the Nightmare on Elm Street remake was all CGI and it looked like
Hmm.
shit. And then
Hmm.
you get The Thing prequel, which I do like the film, don't get me wrong, but when you take a movie like The Thing and you do a prequel to it with all CGI, no thanks. It doesn't look that good. And then
Yeah.
American Werewolf in London, you have the sequel, American Werewolf in Paris. The werewolf transition scenes in those aren't even close
Mm-mm.
to, like American Werewolf in London blows that film away. So
It does.
that's why I don't like the remake prequel sequel, and it'd be just because of those reasons. So
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
I want to go back. I've had an amazing time, Sam, learning about you and how horror started for you, and you are an amazing person. And before I
Okay.
let you go, I have one last question for you. We're going to
Okay.
go back to Poltergeist, and what we're going to do here is we're going to judge this little ditty on a skull count. Now, what we're doing here, we are not judging this on acting, production, score, quality, direction, nothing like that. What we're doing here, Sam, is we're strictly judging this movie on how much it affected you on first viewing. So 0 skulls, not effective. 5, very effective. You can use half and quarter skulls anywhere in the middle. What would your ranking of Poltergeist be?
It would be a 5 for sure because
When
it
when
definitely
you're
drove
sleeping on
me.
mom and dad's floor after, you got to give it 5 skulls.
It is 5, and I immediately followed it up with like 6 other horror movies right afterwards. So yes, 5.
That's so awesome. I'm so happy about that because and like I said, you're gonna be doing the podcast. You already do a lot through Instagram. And like I said, that's how we met. Thanks to
Mhm.
Justin. You're the
Mhm.
man. But like the horror community is such an amazing down to earth group.
Oh, they really
And it's
are.
all inclusive. We don't
Mhm.
care if you're gay, straight, bi, trans, black, white, Republican,
Right.
Democrat. Like the minute you're like, hey, let's talk about Freddy Krueger, I'm like, welcome to primetime, bitch. What you got? Like
Right?
that,
Exactly.
and
And that's
that's
what
what
I
I love
love
about
about
the horror
the
community. Like we don't
yeah,
look at each other by the cover. We look at each other by the book. And
that's
we just understand and respect that the minute you're a part of this community, we accept you and we love you. And I've made some of the best friends at 36 years old that I've ever had because of the horror community. So for you to
same
become
here.
even more a part of this community, I'm so excited to watch you grow and expand and spread your wings even farther than they are right now. So
Thank
um
you.
hey, no problem, guys.
Definitely,
We are
definitely the most fun and the kindest community I've been a part of.
which is funny because we're like, hey, we want to see this guy get stabbed in the balls, ass, and face, but we love you. Like it's awesome.
Yeah.
So we are at the third act, guys. The credits are about to roll. So before they do, there's some links down here in the description that need a click in. So make sure you're clicking these links, following Sam. She needs a priest and everything that she does. Make sure that you're checking out the store because you're going to get a 30% deal just by using the code down here. So make sure you're doing all that. Is that one of the shirts right there?
It is. Let's watch horror movies together. And there's a bloody little knife down below. Down below.
That's so awesome. Like, I love that. So here in future episodes, you'll be seeing me wearing some of that gear as well. So I didn't have enough time to get it before we actually did the episode, but maybe by the time we work together again, some of that gear will be on this chest as well. So Sam, don't go anywhere, please. I got a couple more questions for you. Everybody else, as always, keep talking horror, stay what you are, and we'll see you guys soon.